So this is chapter 6, producer behavior. So firms are the suppliers compared to consumers who are the demanders. The firms are interesting to study because their goal is profit, which is easy to measure, compared to consumers whose goal is utility, which you can't measure. Profit is determined by revenue minus costs. So in this chapter, we're going to ignore revenue and just focus on costs. And costs are going to be the same for firms no matter what their revenue picture is. This is part of the ceteris paribus thinking that we want you to get used to, and it's going to be a powerful tool your whole life. So when you think about how to produce goods, there's a set of assumptions. We're just going to build a model the same way we did on the consumer side. These are captured by what's called the production function. Production function is how do inputs translate into output by the firm. It's a little interesting to think about whether the firm is always doing the best possible, but if their goal is to maximize profit, they will. So we're assuming that the firms know what they're doing all the time. That's another way of saying we assume away mistakes, which is an interesting thing to model, but that'll be a separate problem. On page 205 in table 6.1, it shows an example of a production function where inputs translate into output. An important part of this table is that it derives marginal product, the extra output you get from one unit of input, and it derives average product, which tells you what's going on average. Both of those things are going to translate directly into costs because an important constraint on firm is the input prices. There's a graph at the bottom of that page that does the same thing. So tables and graphs are really easy to do in parallel on this firms because everything is so measurable as opposed to consumers where utility is much more funky to measure. On page 207, it draws another production function and derives it into marginal product. So you want to be an expert at these marginal decisions. We're going to talk about short run and long run. And short run means at least one input is fixed for the firm. So for example, your capital, your plant. That's an extra constraint on the firm. It's sort of interesting to think about how extra constraints matter. In the long run, we're going to assume that all the inputs are variable, so there's no extra constraints, just the usual constraints of whatever the marginal product is of the inputs and whatever their prices are. On page 211, there's a nice graph of the two inputs. So the firm gets a choice, of course, of choosing the two inputs when all the inputs are variable. And the ratio of the marginal products is called the marginal rate of technical substitution. These are all exact parallels to marginal utility and marginal rate of substitutions for consumers. So we're just economizing and using the same theory all over again in this chapter. They talk about the degree of substitutions in the inputs, which is a great thing to do. And then they start talking about minimizing cost. That's the whole point of us building this model, is because we're assuming the firm is going to minimize costs given output. Now, we aren't talking here about how output is chosen. That's the revenue side. So we're going to come back to that in the next chapters about how to do that. And so then the book is talking essentially about the trade-off rate between the inputs, which of course depends on how useful those inputs are. Spends a little time talking about economies of scale, which means that all the inputs increase, not just one. So that's not a marginal decision, that's a bigger decision. People talk about it all the time. Marginal products change, so there's technological change. And we're going to talk a lot about the consequences of technical change. There's a great example here about fisher people in India that have to choose which village on the coast to go to. And then when the cell phones get invented, it's no longer a guessing game. They can find out where they can get the best prices for their catch. And so that market becomes much more efficient as a result of technical change. But technical change happens all over the world, all the time. People continuously push to do things better. You're pushing to improve your marginal product now, right? You're sort of doing internal technical change, because once you learn ceteris paribus, you can make your decisions so much better than you ever did before. Hopefully that'll make you more valuable than the robot the firm is thinking about. In the end, all this production function stuff comes to costs. So when you go to page 231, they start to draw a cost curve. That's really the point of all this stuff, is to get cost curves. And then just like in the indifference curve, theory, we learned how demand curves shift. Once you get the cost curves from this production theory, then you know how supply curves shift. That's the point of this chapter. The next chapter will do the revenue side.